What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another edition of the Pregame Podcast. I'm your host, Corey Smith, here with Jeff Ermann of InsideMDSports.com. Jeff, before we get things started, man, how are you doing?
Doing well, Corey. Like I told you, got a few. Apologize a little bit for my haggardly appearance. We just did a family move right in the middle of all the holiday mania, so I still have the info. The visual presentation might not be great, but the information will be top notch.
Yeah, well, for people that are listening to it too, it'll be great, I'm sure. But before we get things started, I want to remind our listeners, as always, visit our iTunes, Google Play Store, give us a rating if you enjoy the podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure to like and subscribe so that you get these every single time that we make one live. And as always, too, make sure to check out packpride.com. Right now, we are still running through January 2nd a 50% off deal. So if you sign up, it's 50% off. And you'll get Paramount Plus included in that deal too. So it's something we very rarely ever offer. So make sure that you check that out. Head over to packpride.com to find out more about becoming a premium subscriber. So, Jeff, let's start. From the view from 50,000 feet. The program as a whole under Mike Locksley. Just your thoughts on where things have been heading and how this year kind of helped change that. A good solid year for this program too.
Yeah, I mean, it was a step forward. Last year they got to a bowl game for the first time in a while. They ended that slump, and this year they got to 7 wins for the first time in a while, back-to-back bowl games for the first time in about 8 years. So, some programs that are in bowl games every single year and competing for championships would not view that as much of an accomplishment. But when you're Maryland and you've gone through a really rough stretch, I think especially in the Big Ten, as tough as the schedule is, and then, you look at the fact that they really have not been able to compete against the Big Ten's elite. They've been blown out so regularly in recent years. This year, they gave Michigan and Ohio State really tough games. They had chances to win both of those games. So, people hate moral victories, but I think you have to give them credit for that as well.
And a big reason for that, obviously, being Taulia Tagovailoa. Obviously, most people at this point know who Tua Tagovailoa is, but Taulia, a guy that was originally with Alabama, transferred. Or did he transfer or did he flip his commitment? I can't remember which one it was to Maryland.
He spent 1 year at Alabama and he redshirted.
Okay,
so he transferred a few years ago.
Yeah, and I was going to say this past year, over 2,700 yards, has a chance to get over 3,000 yards likely in the bowl game if he throws for, I think it's 213 yards in this one. So what has his season been like, and what have you seen from him that's helped kind of get this offense over the hump?
He's had a good season overall. His numbers aren't quite as big as they were a year ago. He's done a really good job of spreading the ball around. If you look at their offense, there's not many guys, their top receivers are in the 400-yard range, despite, having some pretty big names at the position. He had a really rough stretch of 2 games late in the season at Wisconsin and Penn State, where he played really poorly, combined, I think, for less than 200 yards passing in the 2 games. And then he rebounded against Ohio State, played well despite the loss, and played really well in that shutout to end the year against Rutgers. So, I think you have to give him a pretty good grade for the season. He didn't necessarily make a huge progression from the previous season, but he was still one of the top 3 or 4 quarterbacks in the Big Ten.
And I always like to ask, when you see a high sack rate, obviously 29 sacks on the season, but, I believe it was 17 of those over that 3-game stretch that you just talked about against Wisconsin, Penn State, Ohio State. How big of a deal was that in factoring into his performance in those games? And, how much of it was on him and how much of it was on the offensive line or just him holding the ball for too long?
I would say most of the offensive line, which was not bad this year, but also had some struggles, as you mentioned, those sack numbers. You could definitely see at times, when the offensive line isn't playing well and there's a lot of pressure on him, you can see it start to get into his head. He gets a little bit skittish. So some of that is on him as well. He'll hold the ball in those cases a little bit too long. That's something that, I think they need to improve with the offensive line. He needs to improve a little bit on, when things are going smoothly for him, he's confident and he's one of the best in the country. When it starts to turn south, the protection isn't great, then you can feel the anxiety coming off of him. So That's a good question. That's probably his biggest weakness that he needs to resolve.
Yeah, and I was adding up the numbers earlier. When he's sacked 3 times or less, this team is 6-2 on the season. When he's the only time that he's been sacked more than that and ended up getting a win was, well, no, actually I take that back. The only time that he got sacked more than that and got a win, I don't believe that's happened yet this season. I think it was Purdue was the only loss earlier this season. I'm trying to look back at the numbers now because that doesn't add up. But anyways. Yeah, I think it was like around 6-2 or maybe even 7-2
Yeah,
that he's been sacked 3 times or less. So, all right, now let's move over to to the running backs for this team too, because obviously the playmakers around the playmakers around Talia have been really strong so far this season. When it comes to the running game, I think it kind of starts with Roman Himby. But where do things stand with him, and how good has he been this season?
he's been excellent, for a guy who most people who don't follow Maryland and Maryland recruiting super closely. He's been, a revelation, a guy they hadn't heard all. Heading in the summer, you started to hear some talk that he could be the guy. He was the biggest home run threat out of all these young, talented running backs that they had. And that played out immediately, 100 plus yards in the first game, and kind of kept it rolling, especially when you consider he wasn't getting a ton of carries, around a dozen carries a game. If he has a big game in this bowl game, he has a chance to be the first Maryland freshman to go over 1,000 rushing yards in a season. The second ever to do that. So, and he's also been a threat in the passing game. He's made plays there. He has about 200 plus yards, 3 touchdowns. So, to me, he looks like a rising star. I think he'll be one of the best backs in the Big Ten possibly next year. And then they've got a few other young guys behind him. A kid named Ramon Brown, who was a 4-star recruit last year. Maryland flipped him from Virginia Tech on signing day. He was one that Virginia Tech really wanted badly. I think Maryland thinks he has really, really similar potential to Hemby. And then they've got a few other young running backs who've proven themselves as pretty solid Big Ten running backs. So it's a talented young stable.
Yeah, I was gonna say I got 6 foot, 200 pounds. That's pretty stout when it comes to Himby. So, yeah, and I mean, you look back at the numbers too. Over 100 yards against Northwestern, Indiana, SMU, and Buffalo. I mean, what does he have to do to be able to get over that 1,000 yards? Because he hasn't quite gotten over 70 yards, with the exception of Rutgers over the last 4 games.
When he's more carries, they like to pass to set up the run as opposed to vice versa, which more teams tend to favor, that formula. So, he needs more carries. Obviously, the offensive line needs to block well at times. He'll bust off big runs, and then at other times, you won't see any holes created for long stretches of games. And I know NC State's defense has obviously been stout all season, so that'll be an interesting challenge. And obviously, if Talia is at his best, then you're going to open up some things for the running game, so that would help too.
Yeah, I was going to say he also has 276 receiving yards so far this season. So, what is that? I mean, pretty close to 1,300 total yards on the year that he'll probably have a chance to eclipse as well. Now, looking at the wide receiving core, there's a lot of guys that have 400 yards so far this season, but not really anybody that's been that kind of breakaway guy. Again, I'm looking at the numbers again here. 5 guys that are averaging I take that back, 6, 7, 8 guys that are averaging over 10 yards per reception. Obviously, the biggest issue being, not having that one breakaway guy. Has that been an issue for this team, or has that been, kind of the expectation and the norm?
Well, I wouldn't say it was the expectation. The expectation was that they'd be this explosive passing attack. Rakim Jarrett coming back for his 3rd year at about 900 yards last year. He's been in the top 10 in the Big Ten and receiving each of the past 2 years. He didn't get the ball as much. He had a few more issues with drops this season. Some people suggested to me that maybe it was because he wasn't seeing the ball as much. The drops were the result of not getting as many reps. Dante Demas, who was, on pace last year to lead the conference in receiving, suffered a gruesome injury against Iowa, was out for a year recovering, or a little less than a year, but a long time. Clearly was not as explosive as before. You just hope for him he's able to get that back and become an NFL player at this point. He's not playing. Neither is Jared, and neither is Jacob Copeland, who was a Florida transfer, who had led Florida in receiving the previous year. And, he was probably their best receiver, not, visibly better. If you look at the PFF grades, he was better. His average per catch was better. But again, all those guys are gone. None of them are playing in the game. So it's going to be up to these new guys. And like I said, I think they do have some dynamic talent there with the young guys.
And it was also the tight end, CJ Dupre, that went to.
Yes. So, yeah, the tight end. So they have had two pretty good tight ends. Corey Dyches was one of probably their best third and fourth down receiver, made a lot of plays there, really athletic, converted basketball player, kind of more of a hybrid athlete, only about 220 pounds. And he's going to have to do a lot more because they lost CJ Dupree, their starting tight end, who's transferred to Alabama. So that's really the biggest, their only big portal loss so far.
And so if I'm listening to you correctly, it sounds like Deshaun Jones is going to be, him and Dyches will be the two main targets in this one, more than likely.
Yeah, that's a good call, Corey. Deshaun Jones doesn't have quite the high profile of those three that I mentioned, but he's been a really productive guy throughout his career at Maryland. He's overcome a couple of torn ACLs. He's a playmaker too. They're actually hoping that Mike Locksley has openly kind of lobbied for him to take that COVID year and come back for another year. He hasn't decided yet, but he's definitely one to watch.
Yeah, obviously with Daryl Jones coming over to NC State, he actually has a chance to, to make a big impact in this one as well, because Devin Carter has entered the transfer portal and he's leaving the program. So he's been more or less a starter for NC State on the outside. So now Daryl Jones will get a chance to step up in this one. You look back at the bowl.
I always thought he was going to break out when he was at Maryland. He's got the speed. He is a fast guy, but it just he had made some plays, but it never quite all came together. I saw he's put up some solid numbers though this year, so that'll be interesting to see. I'm sure he'll be extra motivated for this game.
Yeah, he had 2 touchdown receptions in the game against Wake Forest earlier this season, and that was with MJ Morris at quarterback. There's a chance that MJ could play in this one and start in this one. We'll see, where things are at health-wise, but he's been able to practice as well. So that'll be interesting to watch. I mentioned earlier about the, I asked you about the offensive line earlier and keeping Talia Tagovailoa, upright. But how good has this offensive line been so far this season in every, element of the game?
It's been, I would say overall, it's probably been a C+ kind of thing when you consider the expectations. They brought back a ton of experienced guys. So there was an expectation that it would be, really a strength of the team. Hasn't been bad. The sack numbers, as you mentioned, are not good. They brought back Jalen Duncan, who was, earlier this season, their left tackle was projected to be the first tackle taken in the draft. He's had kind of a down year, struggled a little bit. So I think that, he's playing in this game, whereas normally a guy like him might opt out. I think maybe he's trying to put together some final tape before the draft. And then they've got several other veterans on the line. So, at times it's been really good. At times it has. It's been kind of inconsistent, largely depending, obviously, on the opposition. Like you said, that stretch against Penn State and Wisconsin and Ohio State was tougher than the other games. But, overall, it's been a solid, unspectacular line. Not that an offensive line can ever really be spectacular.
And tell me a little bit about this defense on the other side of the ball. Obviously, struggled mightily against the run, allowing over 230 yards per game. But what has been kind of the calling card for this defense so far this season?
They've been, a bend but don't break kind of defense. They don't really blitz a lot. They have a first-year defensive coordinator, Brian Williams, a young rising coach. I think he's, clearly the biggest rising star on the coaching staff among the assistants. He did a good job, and they were 8th in the Big Ten in defense, which, most people might look at as mediocre, but that's been a huge struggle for Maryland since they moved to the Big Ten. They've been last or 13th seemingly every year in defense, pretty much, with the exception of a year or two. And so they got to 8th this year. They were really good in the second half, especially third quarters. At one point, after 7 games, they'd given up, I think, 10 points total in the third quarter. So that's been there. He's made the right adjustments. They have a lot of experience on the defensive line. None of those guys have opted out. The cornerbacks situation is a little sketchy because Deontay Banks, who's their highest graded corner this season, he's a junior who opted out and declared for the draft. So that's another spot where they'll be playing some young guys, and where NC State will definitely try to see if they can take advantage.
All right. And looking forward to this game. I mean, what are I guess when you look at this Maryland team, what are some of the biggest things that they've been working on in order to shore up before they face NC State on Friday?
Yeah, I mean, I would say I don't know if there's anything specific that they need to shore up per se. I would say the biggest thing is the same thing I mentioned, is getting these young receivers familiar and getting them comfortable with being the guy. It's hard to make that step from just an occasional rep to being in the starting lineup and out there for every play. Obviously, I think one thing to watch is penalties. Maryland has been among the most penalized teams in the country all season. Defense has given up, I think, the second most first downs by penalty in the country, whereas NC State has been the opposite. They rank really highly in penalties by their opponents and penalties by their opponents for first downs. So that's something I would also watch closely.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it's 72 yards per week that Maryland has given up in terms of penalties. So yeah, that'll definitely be something to watch. All right, Jeff, give me your thoughts on this game and what you expect to see on Saturday, or I keep saying on Saturday, on Friday, when these two teams match up with each other.
I mean, it's a close game. It could be the closest on paper out of every bowl game, and we both know there's 4,000 bowl games. And I mean, I think on ESPN, had Maryland with a 50.1% chance of winning the game, which goes to show you. So you would think it would come down to the end. Obviously, you never know. Bowl games can be weird because of opt-outs and motivation. In this one, I think Maryland's fully motivated because they're where they wanted to be. They desperately want to get that 8th win. My question about NC State is there any letdown? The fact that they had really high expectations of maybe winning the ACC at some point. So for them, who knows? Maybe it's not. That doesn't always play out that way, but motivation is a big part of these bowl games. It's interesting. I think Tim Beck is not. He's gone. Correct. He's not calling this game. So NC State will be breaking in a new offensive coordinator. That's something to watch also. So I mean, it should come down to the end. I think fairly low scoring. I would probably go, if you made me guess, I would probably go Maryland, 24-21, but clearly, based on that 50.1% projection by ESPN, it's a toss-up.
Yeah, exactly. I agree. And I mean, I think it's going to be a really tough game too. And I wonder about the weather conditions as well, how much it's going to impact things too, because it's been really cold down here. I know Maryland is used to the cold, but these have always been very interesting games that can come down to literally anything, old ACC rivals. So last thing I wanted to ask you too, obviously you've been covering Maryland for a really long time. Do you have any favorite memory from, or maybe not even a favorite memory, maybe just the most memorable moment from this rivalry between the two teams?
That's a good question. I think the hit on T.A. McClendon, if you remember that, NC State had a game completely wrapped up. There was, maybe a minute and a half left. Maryland linebacker named, coincidentally named Leroy Ambush, laid an enormous hit on T.A. McClendon. He fumbles the ball. Maryland wins. I think that, during that series, it was, they might not have been direct rivals as in like NC State and UNC are, but there's definitely a rivalry there. And so the Maryland fans claim to fame that time, I think, was beating Phillip Rivers every time they played him. So that's probably the most, and that was when Maryland really had it rolling under Ralph Friedgen. So, it's not like it was always that way. The series is 34-1 or whatever it is, literally tied after 70 or so games. So that's probably, I would say the T.A. McClendon game, though, for me would be the most memorable. For your listeners, probably the ones that they want to not be at all remembered.
Yeah, I was going to say, it wasn't the 21-point comeback, or I want to say that was either 2011 or 2012. I can't remember exactly when that game was, but it was the one at Carter Finley. They were down NC State was down 34-14 at the half or something. And then Maryland comes out the second half and scored another touchdown. And it was everybody's kind of hitting, thinking about leaving. And I remember being at that one. That was my wife's last game as a student. And so she was like, I don't want to leave this game. I want to be there. I want to watch it, even if it's a bad one. And it ended up being, a great win for NC State. Not the way they wanted to go about it, but definitely an interesting one overall. So, Jeff, first of all, before we head out of here, or last of all, before we head out of here, where can people follow your work, and where can people interact with you?
Yeah, thanks for asking. It's on Twitter. I'm just JEFF_ERMANN. Site obviously inside MDsports.com. We cover Maryland sports and recruiting all day, every day. So for a Maryland fan or NC State fan who just wants to read up on the Terps, come check us out.
Perfect. All right. Well, Jeff, I appreciate you jumping on, man. And thank you to everybody for listening. We'll have much more content from this game leading up to Friday's matchup. It's Friday at noon, not Saturday. So thank you again to everybody for listening. We'll talk to you again.